Please take your Bibles, open up to Job chapter 4. Job chapter 4. We're going to look tonight at chapters 4 through 7, and I'll admit, as I did this morning, I have never tried to preach through 4 chapters in one setting. And I find it a great challenge indeed. But I hope that you'll take your Bibles and we can look at some things going through this text. Of course, the book of Job. Here, God holds out Job as one of the upright. And Satan's like, no, you've just put a hedge around him. You've made it easy for him to be good because you've been so good to him, letting me at him. Well, God allowed it but said, don't touch him. And then very quickly we find his donkeys, his sheep, his camels, and then all of his children taken from him. I cannot imagine. Cannot. But yet this he suffered. And he still was upright. Once again, God calls attention to his upright Job. And Satan's like, you didn't let me touch him. Well, okay, you can touch him, but not his life. And then he was afflicted with boils or great sores. But yet in all of this, we find that he remained upright. Then Job's 3 friends came. And they sat with him for 7 days without saying anything. I think so shocked at his appearance. Then in chapter 3, Job speaks. We've looked at chapter 3, and basically, if you'd sum it up, it's like, I wished I had never been born. And if I had been born, I wish God had let me just die right then. That's how difficult it was. And that brings us now to chapter 4. In chapter 4 and 5, Eliphaz, this first friend, speaks. And then we find in chapters 6 and 7, Job's response to what he has to say. You know, sometimes you've heard this old phrase or saying, well, with friends like that, who needs enemies? I don't know that we'd go that far with these 3 friends, and certainly I think we would say they meant well. And they did come, and they sat with him for 7 days. A lot of good to be said about them. But when they opened their mouth, they just said the wrong thing. And oftentimes, a tragedy strikes someone. Maybe it's a sickness or maybe it's a death. You know, I want to be careful what I say. And sometimes the best words I know to say are just simply, I'm sorry. Because it's so easy to sometimes say the wrong thing. Chapter 4. If you look at verses 1 and 2, can I just sum that up? You know, Job, I've got to say something. But you probably don't want to hear it. But, kind of summing up now, verses 3 through 5. Let me tell you something. You, by your words of instruction, you've helped others. You've strengthened others. You've upheld others. Well, now I'm going to speak to you. But you know, and this word impatient is used. I think it's kind of like, I don't think you're really going to want to hear it. And then he even goes on to say, in the last part of verse 5, it touches you and you are dismayed. You know, sometimes you've heard people say, yeah, you dish it out, but you can't take it. And I think that's almost like what he's saying. You've spoken when others have had their troubles. Now you can't take it when you've got the troubles. And then look what he starts in on. Look at verse 7. Remember, who was innocent ever perished? Who that was innocent ever perished? You see his implication. His implication is the innocent don't perish. Kind of like the innocent don't have the troubles. Job, you've lost all of your wealth. with your donkeys, with your sheep, with your camels. Job, you've lost all of your family. You're not innocent. That's kind of the conclusion. And then he goes on to say in verse 8, he says, as I have seen those who plow iniquity and sow trouble reap the same. Now this is that sowing and reaping principle. You'd find it in the Old Testament in Hosea chapter 10, verse 43. In the New Testament, Galatians chapter 6, verses 7 and 8. And we understand the sowing and reaping principle. You sow to the flesh, you reap corruption. You sow to the Spirit, you reap life everlasting. You sow iniquity, he says, you reap trouble. You've got trouble. That means you must have been plowing or sowing iniquity. And then he goes on to make mention of the results. Verse 9, perish. Verse 9, consumed. That's what happens. That's the way you are. You're guilty. By the way, verses 10 and 11 mentions the lion, the fierce lion, the young lions, the strong lion, and the cubs of the lion. It's almost to say, even the lions, they're guided by this principle too, the sowing, the reaping. Now verse 12, there it gets kind of interesting. He says, I've had this vision. And he talks about this deep sleep and this whisper in his ear that he hears. In verse 14, how a spirit glided past his face and the hair of his flesh stood up. Now someone might say, wait. Did he receive this vision? If he did, was it a vision from God? And if it was a vision from God, did he interpret it correctly? Realize this. This was the patriarchy days. So it's not out of reason that God could have dealt with him as a head of household and given him a vision. And we find as well some principles. But is he misapplying them? Verse 17, you see, comes to kind of the conclusion of these things. Can mortal man be in the right before God? Can a man be pure before his Maker's light? God's here. Man's here. Then he makes the application, verse 14, to angels and how some of them didn't even measure up. And so then he gets down further in verse 19. So much more so then, those who dwell in houses of clay. Once again, man. Man falls short. You see, his implication is Job. You haven't done as right and as good as you think. And that's why you're having all of these troubles. Now look at chapter 5. Hey, we did pretty good getting through a chapter that quick, didn't we? Now chapter 5. He says, call now. Is there anyone who will answer you? Is there anybody that will defend you and stand up for you and say you've been upright? Then look as he gets down to verse 8. He says, as for me, I would seek God, and to God would I commit my cause. And now in verses 9 through 16, frankly, it's a beautiful and a wonderful presentation of God and his works and providence. I mean, it is. It's beautiful. I want to read it, because I want you to hear it. Job 5, beginning of verse 9. Who does great things and unsearchable, marvelous things without number. He gives rain on the earth and sends waters on the fields. He sets on high those who are lowly, and those who mourn are lifted to safety. He frustrates the devices of the crafty, so that their hands achieve no success. He catches the wise in their own craftiness, and the schemes of the wily are brought to a quick end. They meet with darkness in the daytime and grope at noonday as in the night. But he saves the needy from the sword of their mouth and from the hand of the mighty. So the poor have hope, and injustice shuts her mouth. It's a beautiful consideration of the works and providence of God. If he had just stopped there, that might have been okay, but he keeps going. And look at verse 17. Behold, blessed is the one whom God reproves. Therefore despise not the discipline of the Almighty. Job. Let's just summarize this. Job. If you would accept God's reproof, He'll bless you. You're this way because you messed up. Accept God's reproof. He'll fix it. And then he goes on to say about God's, if you would, fixing it. Verse 18, for he wounds, but he binds up. He shatters, but his hands heal. He will deliver you from 6 troubles. In 7 no evil shall touch you. In famine he will redeem you from death, and in war from the power of the sword. But you see, all of this is premised upon Job. You've done wrong, Job. That's why you're suffering in this way. Job is God's reproof. And if you will kind of respond to that reproof, God will bless you. And he's so sure of himself. Look in verse 27. Behold, this we have searched out. It is true. Hear and know it for your good. Eliphaz is so sure of himself. You know, I'm not suggesting here that we don't speak and have confidence. But we need to be having confidence in the pure Word of God and be careful about our surmises, some of our conclusions. Eliphaz, you see, he went down a road that sometimes holds true. The sowing and the reaping principle is biblical. He was going down that road, but he didn't know what was happening with Job, and he was coming to wrong conclusions. Job has to sit through this. Job doesn't agree too much with it. And so you get then to Job chapter 6. Look in Job 6, beginning in verse 1. Then Job answered and said, Oh, that my vexation were weighed, and all my calamity laid in the balances. It's almost like he's saying, if you could just weigh out my troubles. See, right at this point, it's not like he's answering the arguments. He's once again just pointing out his suffering. You know, keep this in mind. No matter what you say, sometimes, and even if you say the right thing, that person that's really, really hurting, when you finish, he's still really, really hurting. That's just how some things are in life. And I know many of you have experienced this Oh, how you appreciate that friend who sits with you 7 days. And you appreciate that they try. But it still hurts. And he's like, if you could just weigh it. He says, verse 3, it'd be heavier than the sand of the sea. You know, by the way, it's interesting. Sand versus... Looking for Austin, our soil scientist. Sand's unique because it naturally compacts. Whereas dirt, it does compact and it takes time. Somebody filled up my sister's swimming pool many years ago. He says, I use sand. He says, if I go out and get some field dirt, he says, and I put it in that pool, he says, every year it's going to sink an inch or two. Every year to keep it level, you're going to have to come in and bring in water. If I bring in sand, it naturally compacts. He says, you'll never have a problem. He says, it's going to cost me a little more. It costs you a little more up front, but it's doing it right. You see sand naturally compacting, yes, a bit heavier. Heavier than the sand of the sea. Have you ever been on a seashore and just saw the sand? We were on vacation and we went to the Kailua beach. It was early in the day and nobody much was there. You go at the right time. But I was told that if you walk down at the very end, there's this White House, and that's where Obama vacations when he's in Hawaii. So I said, Tish, let's walk down there. She's doing like this. That was her response that day. She walked a little ways with me. She said, I'm just going to stay here. You keep going. I didn't know this, but by the time I had walked down there and gotten back, it was about 5 miles to 6 miles of walking in the sand. It didn't look that far. And that was just sand, 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 sand. And he says, I hurt so bad. If you could take all the sands of the sea, weigh it. It's worse than that. Here's how I feel. Verse 4. The arrows of the Almighty are in me. It's like, I feel like God's against me. He says, my spirit drinks their poison. The terrors of God are arrayed against me. That's how he feels. He feels like God's against me. And then he says, this is kind of interesting, verse 5. Does the wild donkey bray when he has grass? I know somebody might say, what are you talking about there? In other words, the donkey having grass, it's satisfied. And he's kind of saying to them, you don't understand. You have it good right now. You don't have the troubles. You don't understand. And they didn't. Then verses 8 through 10. Kind of like a chapter 3. It was like a God. If I was going to summarize these 3 verses, it's God, please let me die. That's how hard it is. But now look at the end of verse 10. Kind of halfway through it. He says, for I have not denied the words of the Holy One. For I have not denied the words of the Holy One. This is one of several statements that indicates that he maintains his integrity. He's not submitting to Eliphaz, you've plowed iniquity. No. I've not denied the words of the Holy One. Verses 11 through 13. Once again, to sum it up, I don't know if I have the strength to wait for death. This is how bad it hurts. But Eliphaz, I'm not going to let you get away with this. Verses 14 through 21, he reproaches his friends. Look at verse 14. He who holds with kindness from a friend forsakes the fear of the Almighty. My brothers are treacherous as a torrent bed, as torrential streams that pass away. Friends, this is how he is characterizing Eliphaz and Bildad and Zophar, and specifically now Eliphaz, because what he has had to say. And then look down at verse 22. Have I said, make me a gift? Or from your wealth, offer a bribe for me? It's like, I haven't asked for you money. You haven't given me anything. Why are you treating me this way? Will be kind of the thought in the summary. And then verse 24, teach me and I will be silent. Make me understand how I have gone astray. It's like saying, okay, you said I plowed iniquity. Where's the proof? The implication again is I have maintained my integrity. So twice now, basically saying I've maintained my integrity. And in verse 26, he speaks of his speech as a despairing man. And then in verse 27, what an indictment against these friends. You would even cast lots over the fatherless and bargain over your friend. It's almost like he's saying, you are as heartless as one who would sell an orphan child of a debtor. Then look at this last verse, verse 30. Is there any injustice on my tongue? Third time. In essence, I'm innocent. And Job maintains his integrity. Oh, he's troubled. He's lost all of his wealth. He's lost all of his children. He's miserable physically because Satan was allowed to touch his body. And so, how do you bear under that suffering? Death would be easier. But he has done right. And he has maintained his integrity. He's been he's been just like what God said he was. Both in chapter 1 and chapter 2. He was the upright man. And continues to be. Chapter 7 verse 1. Has not man a hard service on earth? He mentions then the hired hand. He mentions in verse 2 the slave. He mentions the hired man again. In essence, he's just saying most men have it hard. They even have, he says, verse 4, we could sum that up by saying sleepless nights. All of this is how he feels. Look at verse 6. Verse 6. My days are swifter than a weaver's shuttle and come to their end without hope. I really think two of the saddest words, when they're put in conjunction, put together, are these two words, without hope. What is he enduring? If only there was, saying, that glimmer of light, that bit of hope, something to hold on to. But so miserable. Here's how he feels. That he's without hope. Then in verse 11, we're going to drop to verse 11. He says, therefore I will not restrain my mouth. I will speak in the anguish of spirit. I will complain in the bitterness of my soul. That really sums up chapter 3, when basically says, I wished I had never been born, and if I was born, I wish God had just took me right then. I want to read this verse again, verse 11. Therefore I will not restrain my mouth. I will speak in the anguish of my spirit. I will complain in the bitterness of my soul. This has to do with the speaking. Interestingly, in chapter 6, verse 3, we see Job, it's kind of mentioning him talking rashly. He's speaking as a despairing man, chapter 6, verse 26. And then we have the phrase in chapter 42, verse 3 of how he's without understanding. He's done the right thing, but he's hurting, he's miserable, he's confused by it all. So he talks rashly, despairingly, and without understanding. And this is where he says some things with regards to God. It's out of not understanding, not knowing. In verse 12, am I the sea or a sea monster that you set a guard over me? Why does this have to be done to me? Am I that bad? When I say my bed will comfort me, my couch will ease my complaint, then you scare me with dreams and terrify me with visions. Down in verse 17. What is man that you make so much of him, and that you set your heart on him? If I were going to kind of paraphrase this, put it in my own words, God, you're God. Why do you pay so attention to man, and why is your heart against me? You see, he's speaking out of anguish of spirit. He's speaking out of bitterness of soul. Verse 18, visit him every morning and test him every moment. There's no relief. Verse 19, how long will you not look away from me, nor leave me alone while I swallow my spit? It's almost like saying, this doesn't let up. Not even enough for me to swallow. Verse 20, if I sin, what do I do to you, you watcher of mankind? Why have you made me your mark? Another translation says target. Once again, he's speaking out of anguish of spirit, out of bitterness of soul. And he doesn't understand and know. So God, why is this happening? God, why have you done this to me? You've made me your target. Why have I become a burden to you? He says, why do you not pardon my transgression and take away my iniquity? You know, verse 20 says, if I sin. Well, see, he had been a man of integrity. But if I had sinned, why don't you just forgive me and let's get beyond this? And he says, but now I shall lie in the earth. You will seek me, but I shall not be. You see, these previous verses is, God, why are you doing this to me? Why do you almost like relentlessly pursue me? Why? I have this so much trouble. And it's like you won't leave me alone, not even long enough for me to swallow. But that's the verse 21. But one day I will lie in the earth. That's as if to say, one day I'm going to die. Then you seek me and I shall not be like you. Then you trouble me. You can't. Life's no more. You know, when I was preparing for this, I really thought, and let's face it, this is discouraging. It's troubling. It's hard to walk away with, okay, I've learned this and here's how I'm going to do and live better. But just kind of some observations as we finish. Be careful. When you're the Eliphaz, when you're the friend trying to help, be careful what you say. And sometimes less is more. He probably would have been helped more had they just continued to sit with him another 7 days. Be careful, be really careful about the conclusions you come to, because they may be false. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, as well as Job, did not know about the conversation that God had with Satan in chapter 1 and God had with Satan in chapter 2. And so they come to some wrong conclusions. Let's be very, very careful about conclusions, or else they could be wrong. And one thing too, when I get to Job, I think, Job, he says some things about God. Let's be careful what we say about God, because once again, maybe we don't know about the chapter 1 or the chapter 2, even in our own lives. And maybe we, in our suffering, speak out of anguish of spirit, the bitterness of soul. But the last thing is, once again, Job. He maintained his integrity, and he kept trying to do what was right. And no matter what we face, that is how we need to be. And that's 4 chapters in 30 minutes. If we could assist you in your obedience tonight, if it's a matter of baptism, if there's a need for prayer, we would be glad to help you with these things tonight. If you need to come, please come as we stand and sing.